Thanks. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you to Nexans for hosting me and what promises to be hopefully a very interesting and diverse panel. Offshore wind is truly a generational opportunity, and so we have a great group of folks from industry and from the advocacy space to talk about the opportunities and the challenges that the industry faces. So first we have Ragnhild Katteland. She's the CEO of Nexans Norway and the Executive Vice President of Subsea and Land Systems in Nexans. Ragnhild holds a master's degree in electrical engineering from the Norwegian University of Technology in Trondheim and has more than 28 years of experience in the offshore cable industries. Subsea and Land Systems Business Group is a global business group delivering high-voltage cable systems with years of experience in turnkey export cable projects. Nexans also has delivered the dynamic export cables for the first offshore floating wind farm, Hywind. Next, we have, you can hold your applause. Next, we have Heather Reams. She's the president of Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions Forum, a right-of-center nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that engages policymakers and the public about responsible, conservative solutions to address our nation's energy, economic, and environmental security while increasing America's competitive edge. Heather has been the chair of the National Clean Energy Week since 2017, which will celebrate its 6th annual celebration next week, September 26th through 30th. She is the Western Caucus Foundation a Western Caucus Foundation Advisory Board member and serves on the board of directors for the American Conservative Coalition and the Conservative Climate Foundation. Third, we have Nate Titai. He is head of Equinor's Washington office and is responsible for their U.S. government and public affairs. Nate was previously VP for communications for Equinor's international and U.S. business units. Nate joined Equinor 13 years ago after several years as an attorney practicing energy and environmental law. And finally, we have Troy Patton, who is the head of program execution for Orsted. In this role, he's the North American anchor for QHSE, engineering, procurement, construction, and IT activities, that is quite the portfolio, related to the company's also quite large portfolio of clean energy projects. Troy has decades of experience in power generation, beginning with serving in the nuclear navy, working in control and engineering and engine rooms of nuclear submarines and an aircraft carrier. Troy has an undergraduate degree in engineering from Virginia Tech and an MBA from Clemson. So everyone, give our panel of experts a round of applause. Wow. And I'm going to sit down. So great to have all this brain power and offshore wind in one place. And I kind of just want to start with the big question, which is why, not just why offshore wind, but why offshore wind right now in September 2022. You want to start it off?
Of course. We have just heard the importance of environmental renewables and to reach our climate goals. And one of the renewables that we are working on a lot is offshore wind. So of course, offshore wind is, for us, key to reach our climate target. Basically, easy as that.
I think that the technology is really there. It's exciting to think about the innovation that's been going on over a number of years. And that it's just exciting to think about all the investment, the R&D that's happened to be able to say, hey, let's build offshore wind where the wind blows and really capture it and send it to city centers that really need that energy.
Yeah, I think the expertise certainly resides on offshore wind elsewhere but here, but I'll do my best. But I think Adrian said it well with respect to the oceans. I mean, I think that's where it starts. It's kind of course, how we protect the environment. But I also think, we're at such a critical juncture in terms of energy, what we see with the situation in Europe and the trilemma of climate, of energy security, and of economic time, and we're facing these in real time. They're not theoretical issues, so I think this is the perfect time to talk about the opportunities within offshore wind.
I think Christopher started us off well in his introduction talking about how much more electricity we're going to need. So with plants decommissioning, the need for more energy as we replace those plants and let's continue to electrify the economy, I'll answer a more direct question of why offshore wind off the northeast United States coast right now. and that is the overwhelming energy need, the unbelievable resource that exists right off the coast here in relatively shallow waters, and the ability to pipe that resource directly into load centers where there is demand and not have to run large transmission projects over land. Can you imagine trying to permit through New York City right now? I mean, you have the ability, unique ability to do that off the Northeast coast right now and inject a large amount of clean renewable energy to the Northeast where it's needed. So that's my answer to why right now.
So I think these are all good answers, but I also, Heather, I want to sort of start with you a little bit. These are all blue states, right? How do we get offshore wind? And so we're telling a good story about climate and the energy needs, again, of like metropolitan areas right on the eastern seaboard. But offshore wind, these are long project timelines. It takes 10 years from the planning process to steel in the water. How do you sustain political support for offshore wind here in the United States?
Big question. As the Republican on the stage in defending it, I say it's been a transition for Republicans. I mean, after all, Republicans are not in favor generally of mandates and government subsidies, and we know that there's some subsidization going on in the industry. So that does create a challenge. The second challenge, as you mentioned, is the geography. We've got a number of states, thinking off the coast of Maine. Susan Collins, who is a Republican, a senator, is very supportive of offshore wind, but so is her counterpart in the state, Angus King, who is an independent. So it does have to do more with geography than it does political party. It's important to meet members where they are. We're looking now at potential offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico, for instance, where you have those so-called red states. And I think those dynamics are going to change quite a bit as you diversify offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, not just to the oil and gas sector, but then to the offshore wind sector. And there's a ton of opportunity. Members just need to hear about it. The political members just need to hear about it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I personally, trying to the best extent we can in the current times that we live to take partisanship out of this topic is extremely important. This is a bipartisan topic, providing energy affordable, cleanly. It is something that spans, it is a geographic issue, of course. There are different types of sources and things that will apply to different parts of the country, for example. Offshore wind, a great opportunity in the Northeast. However, the industry needs to, I think, for sustainability, needs to find the opportunities across different supply chains that penetrate parts of the country. And again, how do we, if you will, take down the rhetoric and look towards solutions? Today I'm sure we'll see language from Senator Manchin on permitting. I think permitting is a topic where you see a lot of bipartisan support and recognize that there are challenges within the process. Regardless of the energy source. And I think it's in all of our best interests to try to address that to the best extent we can, putting politics aside. And I say that very humbly.
We're going to dig into permitting in a couple minutes, but Troy, what's Orsted doing?
Well, I think we think about this a little bit like the renewable industrial complex that needs to be created to serve the industry, both and take a page from onshore. They've done a brilliant job, I think, in the last 2 decades of building bipartisan support. For ourselves, we have supply chain investments in 44 U.S. states. We're sponsoring vessels that are being built in Texas and in Louisiana right now. We're building the first offshore substation that's going into South Fork Wind next year in Texas right now. We're making very deliberate choices. It's not a coincidence that one of our first steel orders was from a mill in West Virginia. So we're thinking about this as systematically as we can in terms of getting lots of support from both sides of the aisle.
I think also it was part of Chris' speech and also the panel before. Ultimately, we're talking about climate, and we all agree that we need to do something for the climate. And in this region, offshore wind is one of the positive and easy accessible, in a way, if permits put aside, that we can actually do. We have, as you say, we have the technology, we have the means, we have the knowledge, and we can do it.
So I do want to ask you one quick follow-up question on climate change. How do we get the climate change to be less of a sort of partisan football?
Partisan issue. I'll build on what I had said earlier. At times it's been the wrong message with the wrong messenger and going to Republicans and creating this very divisive political climate. And my organization focuses on bringing Republicans along. So I work exclusively with Republicans about clean energy and climate change, climate solutions, which is challenging work. For sure, but I've been very pleased to see how Republicans are acknowledging the value, for instance, that clean energy, offshore wind, the opportunities that are there. Innovation is a pillar for Republicans, and in thinking about the technology available, what we're seeing on the walls, a lot of this amazing technology, the fleet, the boats, it's not just the wind turbine, it's not just moving it, it's everything around it, and the tremendous amount of jobs, the multi-billion-dollar industry that it is, and with offshore wind, kind of speaks to like, why not offshore wind? What's the holdup? And I think the economic value will continue to climb and climb. I'll also talk about the, I want to mention the energy independence piece of it as well. We're dealing with price increases. Everyone wants to see prices come down, but we want to see that independence here in the United States. And anything that we're producing is homegrown energy. Who doesn't want that? So I think that's another area where Republicans are like, yeah, we got it. And then by the environment, clean air and clean water. So this all works together. It's just multiple legs of a stool rather than just one.
Well, you got ahead of my next question because the theme of our panel is energy independence, and I want to hit that head on. So, Troy, if you want to kick us off on why, obviously, it's all come to a head with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the crisis that Europe is facing. Why is offshore wind such a critical piece of, I guess, what is energy independence, and why is offshore wind a critical solution?
I mean, to pick up on what Heather said, I don't think this energy transition happens in a year or two. I think it takes a decade or two. I do believe in all of the above, maybe not every single bit of the above, but a whole lot of the above. And I think geography and economics, commercial interests will define where in the country or in the world certain technologies are best suited to satisfy the needs there over the next couple of decades. And that may mean gas, and it will certainly mean offshore wind and onshore wind and solar and the green molecule that comes from hydrogen or e-methanol or ammonia. Talking about the Gulf, I mean, our ability to use offshore wind in the Gulf to help provide the green molecule that helps green some of the industrial processes that need methanol and need ammonia there, being able to produce that in a green way that provides lots of jobs to those states as well, I think is critical to how we tell our story more holistically than just looking through one lens.
Yeah, I think it's tough because the phrase or the term energy independence, it's kind of the same as energy transition. I think if we asked people what their definition of those two terms were here, people would have very different answers. Maybe some similar in certain ways, but there's a lot of ways to phrase the topic. And what is pure energy independence? I mean, there's probably an answer to that, but I've not heard a good kind of expression of what true energy independence looks like. I mean, there are elements, I think, of affordability, of certainly physical security, supply chains, other things that need to be addressed, but it's a complex picture, and I think whether we have an open, honest dialogue on what energy independence looks like, again, because not to inject politics into it, but it does go there. And I think, for example, in Europe, we've been discussing energy security as a topic for years, decades. Now it hit more than ever, of course, and now the challenges and the questions are forced into the dialogue. So I think it's a lesson for us to say we don't have the luxury of kind of debating these philosophically. They are here now, but it's going to take a lot of responsibility, a lot of collaboration, and not just by one specific country to do it. So I think, to me, it's a debate that's ongoing, but the parameters of it are still being defined.
So what lessons can we learn from Europe? I mean, you're in the eye of the hurricane, so to speak, in terms of using clean energy to achieve independence from perhaps countries that wish us ill.
I think I want to turn it a little bit around, actually. We have alluded to the, yes, in Europe, we have seen now the consequence of the Ukrainian crisis, gas, etc. And we see the importance of being independent, actually, to be able to have enough energy so that we can continue our daily life. And what I also see, and I think maybe we'll come back to that later on, is also now a competition of building these renewables coming forward. So on top of being independent, you also will soon, or already, we are creating an atmosphere where there is competition between the countries to build it faster. And this creates even a more complex situation of the independency of electricity than we've seen before.
Well, I want to sort of use that as a jumping off point to, we've talked about all the great things offshore wind can do, but, it would be a short panel if that was, if there weren't challenges. And I think you provide a nice transition to just talking about that global supply chain. And I'll just say, editorialize a little bit. I mean, I think energy independence has to involve the fuel source being something that is domestic. And once you're getting off of sort of the global commodity, that sort of is a precondition to true energy independence. But the supply chain is still global, and that there is the sort of rhetorical question: is true energy independence even possible? I think you were kind of hinting at that a little bit. But how do we manage what are the supply chain challenges here in the United States, and how do we manage them? I don't know if Ragnhild, if you want to sort of kick that off as sort of being in a place where the supply chain first got started.
Yeah. And of course, the supply chain is always starting with the developers, clearly. What we're seeing in the supply chain is that we have built a quite strong supply chain in Europe. Now we're talking offshore wind, of course, and the renewables with offshore wind. What we're doing here now is to try to transmit some of this to supply chain to US and build similar strong supply chain in the US together with our clients, as well together with our suppliers again. Charleston factory is a very good example of what we have done here, building a unique facility in US to support the climate change and support the development of the offshore wind farm. And I think we need to see much more of this going forward. And this creates jobs, and this creates infrastructure that is really pushing, again, it's kind of a new level that also US needs. So, yeah.
So is it that easy? Just build the factories?
Well, there are a number of challenges. I mean, we could talk about ports and infrastructure availability on the East Coast for the East Coast build out, but I think the political support that we hit on before, bipartisan and consistent political support, is super important. When you have energy policy in the hands of elected officials inherently, you're going to have a time frame and have to make sense of that. But I think consistent policy, to the extent that we can benefit all of the above, will be better off providing the solutions that are needed. I think bold moves from companies like Nexans think about making the decision to build Charleston in the Trump administration with all of the uncertainty that exists years ago. It's companies that know what they're doing, that are well-financed, being willing to make some of those moves. I think it's a lot of American companies now not avoiding the temptation to try to do it from scratch and think that they have a better way, and understanding that the lessons that have been hard fought and brought the cost of energy down from a few €100 a megawatt hour down to less than $100 dollars a megawatt hour. Those were hard fought battles, and if we don't want to repeat that again, we can't afford it here in the United States. So bringing some American ingenuity and partnering with those in Europe that have some of that experience and knowledge, can bring the specs and the understanding of material science and what it takes to get that done. That willingness to collaborate is super important for the build out of the U.S. supply chain. It's true in materials, it's true in services as well. Survey vessels. I mean, it goes throughout the value chain for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think Troy says it very well, and I've certainly have colleagues in the audience who probably could speak to better detail than I can, but I think the notion of collaboration and there's an element of trust. I mean, I think we see the turbines at certain points, and in those pictures there are more turbines on the wall than there are in the United States. So the reality is that we're in an early inning one of the baseball game, and I think the notion is that we've been talking about offshore wind for some time. And I think for the supply chain, for the investors, the comfort level is certainly rising. And you see enthusiasm. I mean, it's palpable when you go to events, when you go to conferences, and the direction is there. But ultimately, for investments to be made of the magnitude that we need, there needs to be trust that the facilities will be built. The permitting will allow for it. And I think that's something that when we see the first, that's why it's so important the first commercial scale projects are able to be delivered, generally on time, on schedule, on budget, because that's the reality that's needed, I think, for investors, for the supply chain to grow organically the way we hope. But again, the bold moves by Nexans and others are helping to stimulate that.
Just a comment, what is also important for us to do such investments in the supply chain is, of course, predictability of a portfolio of projects going ahead. That's kind of the starting point of everything. And when we finalized the Charleston plant last year, the first project actually we're not delivering to US. The first project we delivered to was an export cable to UK, a very mature market. Right now, we are producing for an export cable for Troy there, which I'm very happy for. So we are moving ahead in US, but that has taken some time.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, I got asked the question, Troy, your framework agreement with Nexans helped sponsor and finance, help Nexans come up with the financing that they needed to make that bold move years ago. How do you feel about their first cable going to the UK? And I said, I feel great about that because it just demonstrates how competitive we can be right here in the United States on the global stage. And it's a great example, I think. Nexans got to learn its lessons on somebody else's project and figure out what they're doing in South Carolina to deliver to our project. But it was really a best in class, I think, example of what can take place when you bring the right knowledge and the right attitude to the situation.
I wanted to highlight the supply chain issue from more of a political lens too. We hear this a lot from that we've got challenges with supply chains, and we're giving business to China, for instance, rather than bringing it here in the United States. We have the minerals here to be able to be self-sufficient, that energy independence. We have it here, but the permitting process, I know you want to get to that, is nothing but challenging to do so. And ironically, the Biden administration has been more hostile to domestic mining, but very friendly to the expansion of clean energy. So it's kind of like, what do we need here? How do we do this internally? Who do we work with? And with the anti-China sentiment that's generally in the United States, just generally in politics, particularly on the Republican side, it makes the politics even more challenging. So that permitting and starting to mine here in the United States responsibly, not relying on China, but also not relying on nations that don't have strong human rights in place, that aren't mining with the kind of environmental standards that we have, is incredibly important. And that dialogue really hasn't played out in a way that it needs to, so we can get over this barrier, really, to getting to expanding offshore wind and lots of clean energy here in the United States.
Well, and I think there's a tension not just with China, but with European products. I mean, which is a continent with an excellent record of human rights. How do you? I mean, I want to hit on these sort of domestic content requirements that are sort of starting to come through with the Inflation Reduction Act and with the permitting, with permitting reform. How do you? But there is no, we're starting from scratch with the supply chain. How do you reconcile those domestic content requirements with the need, I think, Nate, you said it, to get those first projects in the water and sort of show the value of the industry? How do you walk that tightrope?
Very carefully. It is, and again, trying to be a student of it all. I mean, it's complex, right? Again, and not to kind of punt on this, but We're talking long timelines, many elements that come into it. There is, at this point in time, I mean, the 30 gigawatt goal that the administration set is a phenomenal one, and I think it gives us, you know, something to look to in terms of how to reach that target. But there are a lot of things that have to happen for this to really materialize, and I think, you know, our perspective is that we need to see the building of the U.S. industry, you know, workforce, labor, competence development, these things are going to come along, but how do we bridge the gaps that exist to ensure those first projects are materialized, that give the confidence to investors, give the project developers confidence that we can do this and do it well and effectively. And I think it's a complex topic, but we have to try to create awareness of what are the elements that are here and now that we can deliver on, but what are the things that over time we can infuse more U.S. workers, more vessels, more things that can do the required work. But again, I think we get into the political components of it where it's kind of a black and white issue. It's far from it.
Yeah, I mean, last time I was in Albany, I mean, we have an auction or bids due for a New York 3 auction that's closing December 22nd. Merry Christmas to those working on the bid team. But our companies are competing with others to try to make the point in Albany with Doreen and the team, Governor Hochul's team, looking at the auction criteria that, you know, you need to look at if you're talking about supply chain, you need to look at the fundamentals of supply chain. Labor costs, how important are they to the product that's coming out? Logistics, getting in and out. This is big kit. I was down in the Gulf a couple of months ago, and I had a couple of politicians point at the jackup vessels that are used to install those topsides, and they said, Troy, there's 20 vessels parked here. Why can't you just use them? I said, guys, they're 1/3 the size of what we need. I mean, you really don't understand how big this kit's going to be. It's a lot bigger than the 7 turbines that are installed now, and maybe 3 times larger than that now for what we're going to be installing next year. My point being, stick to labor costs, logistics in and out. How important are those things? CapEx build out. What are the environmental regulations around the CapEx build out to build your factory in New Jersey, where we're helping EEW build a monopile facility versus Ragnhild's South Carolina factory versus the factory that we're building our vessel in Texas right now. So those things all play into where's the right place to situate which supplier of which material in which state and geography. I think those are hugely important. The second one to emphasize in terms of supply chain build out is don't overlook the impact of tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers and sub-suppliers. More value is likely created from the suppliers sending things to the loading docks at one end of that factory than the people in that factory shipping things out and onto the water. So those two things are something we struggle with a lot of state economic development associations and helping them understand where the true value is in placing a supply chain there and the ecosystem necessary around it.
Just to emphasize this one, even though we have a plant in Charleston, which is a fantastic asset, we will build also during a project. We will build a tier 2 and other subcontractors in the area of the project. So I think one of the challenges we have here is that we have to look also across state borders. We cannot have a plant, we cannot have a unique supply chain in every single state. We have to work together to make this happen and to keep the cost down, because that's ultimately what we have to do.
Sure. I mean, it's a war for talent in some ways. I mean, when I was down at Ragnhild's factory earlier, we were looking at South Carolina, and I asked, how do you find people to help staff your factory and train the next generation of workforce? I mean, you're providing well-paying jobs for that area. And she said, we have a Volvo plant nearby, and we very much team up with the technical schools to train a cadre of electrical and mechanical skilled folks that can then decide where their future is going to lead. But we don't try to do that exclusively. We work with the rest of the kind of local environment to train the next generation of workforce, just in terms of awareness and advertising that these opportunities are out there. And they've got a great workforce that's very quality focused, very safety focused, doing work, really high-tech, sophisticated work to supply a product that's globally competitive, as you said before.
Now, I want to get to permitting in a second, because that's
it's your favorite
my favorite topic. Came from that world. But I do want to, we have all these workforce and supply chain challenges. Are there government policies that we need to be advocating for that will sort of help smooth the path. Because if people take anything away from this, it's that this is not on this is not an industry that's on autopilot. It's not inevitable. We need policies, but what are they?
I think I'll say that this is what's so, I've talked to a number of people who are like, who lobby and advocate, and what we think about working with certain committees dealing with energy or the environment. Well, those labor committees and the Department of Labor are also incredibly important, and also the Departments of Education and the technical schools. So this is it needs to be more of a holistic approach, and we're broken up in how we legislate here in the United States. Is these different committees have different jurisdictions, but after all, we do need to educate that workforce. Actually, having the Vogel plant is brilliant, actually, to locate there and thinking about that. So I think that the government, in thinking more holistically, and also the training pieces as well, those are also pieces that often get cut. It seems like it's a giveaway to be training a workforce in some way, but it's the critical part that's going to continue to make that area of the country or that project more successful.
Yeah, I think education, you said, is so important. And it is. I mean, when we look at this as developers, we look at our projects, we think about the Department of Interior, the agencies that we deal with to get the project developed. But as an industry, I think this is where the collaboration is really needed, because it can't be looked through the lens of one developer. And I think this is where the trade associations play a very important role as well. Yes, Josh. Because this is an education, this is a narrative that we need to work with the Department of Labor, agencies that we may typically from other industries haven't had to deal with, because they're developed. They have the sectors in the economy, they have the educational systems in place, the competence development programs in place to do it. We're have to borrow a lot from Europe, from elsewhere, where it's probably been done more, to the point where the industry is up and running. And I think that the education component cannot be underestimated here. And it's having that dialogue, with all the stakeholders that's discussed here. But I think that I think we should look inwardly and say, are we doing a good enough job of that right now? And I think, again, taking off our own company hat, our own trade association hat, and doing it more collectively, because these are challenges I think we face together. And what we see and how we look at our supply chains, the workforce that we need, we can't just do it on our own spreadsheets. We have to kind of culminate them together.
Yeah, I think with 31 wind farms in operation and 7 of the 16 awarded projects in the U.S., we had a bigger mandate to go after this piece, I think, than anybody else. We worked directly with Secretary Walsh's staff on labor policy and incentives that could be provided across the board. So we worked with organized labor and signed the first national offshore wind agreement with the trade unions for construction, a commitment to paying prevailing wage for our projects. But we also worked with a whole bunch of technical schools and training schools across the country to train a generation of workers. There's a ton of maritime crewing in the Gulf that's going to be provided to build and operate our wind farms long term. I think it's just as important there. And I will say the Secretary is very focused on organized labor. At the same time, he's also focused on putting all Americans at work. And so I think it's a careful balance of policies that make sense in the development phase, during the construction phase, and then for 35-year long-term operation of our assets. And we found this administration to be a great partner for that.
So none of this happens if we don't get these projects approved, right?
Right.
What's the biggest challenge in terms of getting these projects through the review process, over the finish line, so that people can, that you folks can feel certainty, all three of you, to make those investments? What's the problem and what's the solution?
I'll say politics, first of all. Super challenging. It sounds like we're going back to politics a lot, but there's a lot of politics in dealing with this growing industry, which is unfortunate. And there's just a lot of barriers to getting steel in the ground. And and it's not just legislatively as well. There's a lot of organizations that advocate. There is lawsuits that challenge and delay. So having some certainty through permitting, that not to say it's not going to go through the courts, because it may well, even though it passes. But this is where it feels like we're on one side of the aisle, and from the left side of the aisle, it's we have to continue to protect the environment, what we have, and the regulations that we have today are created to protect the environment. And then another part of it is like, well, these these regulations are outdated, and we've been able to modernize, and modernizing our permitting reform needs to be part of that. Our permitting needs to be part of that. And are we giving something? And then you have more of a Republican, and that's kind of a center, and then on the right, where it's limited government overall, and permitting has been a long-standing principle for Republicans. And so I think the good news is this is a great place for bipartisanship, that you can talk about the permitting pieces and what we need to have. And we're having that debate in Washington right now. That is going on. And how much do we need to give over here to get this? And that dance and that balance is what we're going through right now. And we need to have that conversation. I'm not optimistic politically we're going to see something in the next few months. I don't know if anybody else on this panel is. I'm not. But at best, we need to recognize what we're building in terms of dialogue so that we can talk about where we're heading. We haven't really done that. It's kind of been like, oh, we've accidentally gotten this, and oh, we've accidentally done this, versus like, this is where we're heading, this is our North Star, and this is a permitting that lines up to where we're going. We don't have that in the United States at this time.
I would say that the good news is that there's a clear recognition that the system is not optimal, being kind. But I think, again, it is, and there's a growing recognition that we see this in renewable energy, we see this now with the advent of carbon capture and utilization and sequestration, hydrogen, natural gas infrastructure, LNG exports, it spans the industries, it spans the energy sources. I think it's very positive that we're having at least a robust dialogue on it. It is a topic of discussion. So that gives us hope, whether it's able to be accomplished. I'd like to be optimistic over the next several months, but if it's not, it's something that I think there will be a continuing dialogue on, which is a good thing. But we won't see the benefits. Between the bipartisan infrastructure package, between the Inflation Reduction Act, we see over around $500 billion of new spending over the next decade to address climate and energy transition. That's wonderful. But it doesn't happen without the ability to develop the projects that we've talked about here. And permitting reform is essential to that. Is it going to be done with one opportunity? Probably not. It's probably something that's going to be incremental. That's the way we often do things. But any improvements will help.
Yeah, I turn the lens on a different part of permitting that probably doesn't occur to everybody right up front, and that is the NEPA process, Department of Interior and Commerce working through the COP process. I can tell you we have 4 projects in that process right now. We have 2 that haven't started, but those 2 that haven't started yet, we started years ago investing tens of millions of dollars in queue positions to connect to the grid. We have for years been running electrical analysis to try to satisfy NERC, FERC, PJM, the local grid utilities, and help them understand what an injection of our gigawatts is going to mean to their grid. That process is, if possible, in need of even more reform than the federal permitting process. So I would turn a lens there. If I'm asked what are the biggest risks to my project, I think we can put in a box with a cost and a time associated to getting through the COP process and getting in the water. The electrical grid interconnect process where all these cables connect, that is not very well coordinated. And it's very different to do business. We're connecting in Rhode Island, we're connecting in Connecticut, we're connecting in New York, we're connecting in New Jersey, we're connecting in Delaware, and the process is different everywhere. And it's not consistent. The turbine generator manufacturers are not very sophisticated in their modeling. They face this problem in onshore, we're facing it in offshore now. So we certainly deserve we deserve focus with Amanda Lefton and the rest of BOEM, but I would say on the grid side, there's just as much a challenge that stretches the permitting process out even longer and brings the risk right up until you're going in the water front and center for project managers.
I think it is a positive, again, I'm trying to, is that we see the staffing levels, very well, Josh. People are stretched. They're being asked a lot. And there are a lot of very capable, good people that we work with across the agencies that I think we all have a common goal. But so the staffing levels, you know, and the appropriated money for that is very, very important. We're happy to see it, and frankly, probably need more. And so I think that is a step in the right direction, but building on that I think is important. But you know, anywhere we go, it's predictability and certainty. I mean, those are the two terms that we use everywhere, regardless of the country. And how do we move toward that goal? And that is, I think, ultimately what will get us to a point where we're all looking back in 2030 and say, hey, we finally got there.
Just thinking about, we're talking about the Delaware and in different areas, and the uniqueness of the United States of having a country, but also having 50 states and 50 jurisdictions plus the federal. Oh, and I didn't mention the local level as well. So there are multiple layers of government, and one can easily say, oh, federal government says we're going to do this and we're going to do it. Well, there'd be mutiny. It's not the way our country is created. Right. So we're having these challenges in moving electricity or moving energy from one place to the next already. So this is not unique, but it is unique maybe to the United States than in other countries.
Well, and even if you could wave a wand and say, okay, only the federal government is made up of dozens of agencies. I mean, BOEM is the lead agency, but like BOEM has to coordinate with at least a dozen other agencies, all of which have their own statutory mandates and their own, you know, career staff with sort of sometimes competing authorities, or priorities, I should say, and authorities.
These are absolutely real challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw the same thing in Germany with BSH. We saw the same thing in the Netherlands. We saw the same thing in the UK over the last decade. Things did streamline. There was some interagency cooperation that helped get better, but all of that took time. And it was through multiple administrations. And I think it's hard when you're looking for predictability to be patient. And I feel like we've been patient. I mean, it's 2022. Let's get on with it already. I think we've got an administration that's ready to help us streamline, and it's time.
Well, and I was going to say, you know, you've been in Europe, and like, what are some lessons maybe that we can learn in terms of
I
governance?
just hope that we can actually take some lessons from Europe and use them here, so that we don't need to use decades to have wind farms in the water in a successful manner. You're talking about permitting to build the wind farm. What we see is that, of course, also restrictions. What type of workforce can we actually import to US, to train here in US, to build the wind farm? It will take also for the workforce, it will take too long time to build the workforce in US with the right competence level to build these first wind farms. So also here we need to have regulations or less restrictions so that we're able to do it.
I would also say that it is important, you know, again, the administration has announced many goals, but you know, when we talk about offshore wind, I do think it's heartening to see that at agencies you see senior leadership looking to say, we have a common goal here. The 30 gigawatt goal is driving us. And how that filters down through the organization and to set a strategic goal, not to abandon the work that's been done or to do it in a different way, but to say, okay, how do we balance our goals of biodiversity, of environment with climate? I mean, we talked about oceans at the beginning. And of course, climate change is impacting the oceans. And that should also be part of the agencies that are addressing this topic, but to do it, again, in a way that provides some certainty and predictability and balances these needs. It's not an easy job. I don't think it's fair to say that it's just making a choice like that. But I think there is a way, and I think it is a good dialogue that we're having. And again, it gives me optimism to think that the administration as a whole and the way they're coordinating across the agencies is at least kind of moving in a collective direction, which is a good thing.
No, and I think you nailed it. Like, the climate crisis is the connective tissue that'll get, you know, the NOAA and the Fisheries Service to sort of recognize that as the last panel, you know, discussed, that the warming oceans are the existential threat for all these resources that you know, a lot of these agencies are entrusted to. Well, we could talk all day, but we want to hear from the audience. If there's some questions that our expert panel can answer. If we've answered all of them, we can keep talking, but we'd love to hear from folks.
Hands are raised.
Yeah, over here up front.
You spoke about biodiversity, so how concretely are you taking that into consideration as a developer in order to make sure that your impact on biodiversity is minimal?
You want to take it first and then I'll go?
Yep. I didn't quite hear the beginning.
Oh, so the question was...
Sorry not to...
Yeah, no, that's all right. You can throw it onto me, Nate. So
It's an old trick.
the question for those virtual at least was how do we assess and take into account the impacts on biodiversity of all of the construction that we're doing, and I would say onshore and offshore. I mean, there are, for a gigawatt wind farm offshore, there are 4 million man hours used onshore, and maybe 1 million person hours, I'll say, used offshore to do construction. And that's a lot of construction. It's a lot of digging, it's a lot of moving dirt around, it's a lot of putting steel in the ground and on the water. From our side, we've pledged net positive biodiversity by 2030 on all of our projects for life cycle. It's a very public pledge that we made deliberately earlier this year as part of our annual meeting. We are looking at science-based ways to measure the biodiversity before and the biodiversity after. We have the benefit of installing 31 projects around the world so far, and I don't know how many in development, a whole bunch. The point is, every time we do that, we come up with a little library of things we can do onshore and offshore. I would say we've transitioned from, in the last decade, talking about doing offsets to, no, in the community that you're operating in, how do you promote net biodiversity in that community? So how do you promote more life and growing of plants and animals onshore and offshore in all the places that we do construction? I will not tell you that we have the answer. What I'll tell you is we're committed to scientific targets and ways of measuring the biodiversity impacts of what we do both onshore and offshore. That's what we've committed to. We have a number of initiatives, whether it's oyster reclamation, artificial reef growing, offshore, net planting of trees, and working with waterways and funneling water onshore to help attack this problem that we're giving ourselves sort of the rest of the decade to develop this library of options to go after in each of our projects. I will say, with respect to the oceans being global, or the ocean, as I just learned, being global, the biodiversity challenges are very, very local to where we're constructing, and that's the way we view them. So a lot of times it's getting in touch with the NGOs, the universities that are studying the environment in the locality where you're doing construction, and understanding from them what things have worked in the past, what technology can we bring to bear in the future. It's also making a business case for making those investments, and how you do that responsibly as a company is something that we're going to continue to work on through the rest of the 20s.
Well, that was a comprehensive answer. And
I was going to let you go first.
And maybe the difference between operations, commercial versus somebody in government affairs, and the quality of the depth. But I will just say that, one of the things that when we look to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, of course we have a lot of focus on climate, but it shouldn't be to the detriment of the other sustainable goals. And I think biodiversity is a great example. We as a company put a lot of emphasis on that net positive. And when we look at projects, I think there has been a tendency to kind of imbalance these things. So how do we kind of look at, being a former sustainability practitioner, I'm a big believer in looking at that full life cycle, looking at the externalities that we have, understanding through scientific and practical means what we do to address them. But it's something that we can't forget about. I mean, climate is the ultimate issue that we need to address, but these other things matter, and we can't lose focus on them.
The other thing I was going to add is, don't underestimate the power of technology to solve environmental problems. I think we go awry when we have environmental laws that set, sort of very rigid requirements that don't allow that space for innovation. And a good example I'm going to give is NOAA, National Oceans Atmospheric Administration, has proposed a rule to protect the right whale, which we have to do, but their strategy is every vessel needs to go 10 knots or less. And what that doesn't account for is the innovations, the remote sort of monitoring that you can do to allow. I mean, that has obvious effects on the speed at which you can construct and operate wind farms. That has real effects on the viability of projects. But if you allow for technology to sort of protect the right whale in often better ways than just slowing a vessel down, you can achieve better results. If all you have is a 10-knot speed restriction, that's it. There's no innovation to going slower. There's only one way to go slower. It's just one example of how we need to have policies that encourage, and I can riff on 20 different other examples, but I think we ought to really invest our efforts in the ingenuity of American and global scientists and
Since you picked that
innovators.
one, and there are, according to the last report card from memory, so I'm certainly wrong, precisely wrong, 366 North American right whales left, according to the last report card, I think. We have an ex-Navy firm that we're working with to map out the undersea environment using a combination of buoys and autonomous solar-powered catamarans, trailing sonar arrays that can map out the underwater environment. We identified in the last migration season 7 unique upcalls to the North American right whale that scientists didn't know existed before. I think there's a wealth of knowledge. There's terabytes of data right now being generated to understand behavior of the undersea environment and the marine mammals that operate there. We have, so to give a bit of sunshine at the end of this, our first draft environmental impact statement for Ocean Wind 1, one of our projects in New Jersey, does contain a mitigation for the speed restriction. If we employ this technology in a way that will be more protective of the whales than simply slowing everybody down, but actually looking ahead of the vessels at what's in the water in front of us and either being able to steer around it or clear transit corridors, as in the language of the nymphs that we're working with. So there is hope, but I don't think the administration can do that alone. I think it's up to companies and technology providers to help show what's within the art of the possible, to map a way through piling restrictions that are there to protect the marine environment, but operating restrictions as well.
I have a 2-part transmission question. So obviously building offshore is a big challenge, but actually getting that power to consumers has proven to be a big challenge. You have like over 700 gigawatts in the interconnection queue. Congestion on grids is already on the rise. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges or what your discussions are like with grid operators? Like, do you have to get into the interconnection queue of any kind? And the second part is, are you talking to people in Washington about developing national corridors or using eminent domain to build transmission infrastructure?
I can start if you want.
Yeah, I can probably hit on the second one if you want to take that.
All right, so what we're doing at Orsted, we are bid into an SAA right now, a state process. The PJM's running together with the state of New Jersey to put an offshore backbone, a meshed DC backbone offshore to serve as really the socket for all of these wind farms to plug into, not just ours, but everybody's wind farms to plug into, provide a DC connection to shore that injects that power in a place where it can all be consumed. I think that's part of the story. PJM's interconnect queue process is in need of reform. They are looking to reform that entire market right now. That presents a challenge, but also an opportunity to present solutions to some of those congestion problems that exist. State of Massachusetts came out recently and said, transmission's an enabler for all of this. We need to get that part figured out, design the sockets before we can get these long extension cords coming from offshore wind to plug in. The state of New York has pledged to do something similar. We'd like to see more support from the government for all of that. We'd like to see more federal leadership. I mean, we have 5 independent system operators in this country. They haven't played well together. They don't work in an interconnected way, and I think that's a huge challenge. But what we can do is look to Europe. I mean, there's a very congested electric system there that's prevented power from getting to where it's needed. There's never been more awareness of that than there is right now. So what we can do is listen to the public hearings, provide input and models, help maybe model the grid system better than they do to show what's within the art of the possible in the future.
And
No, I
Imagine.
mean,
Advancements in actual cables might help.
no, technically speaking, I mean, what you're saying, to do the right analysis on the grid as it is today and with the new sources coming in, because it's changing and the flow of energy will change. So you can, what we're also providing, talking about technology, is monitoring, better monitoring solutions also. How much can you actually put through these cables that are already existing? However, knowing that the average grid age is old, not only in the US, but also in Europe. So we have to do something on the grid side. Whatever we do, even without renewables, we have to do something on the grid side.
Yeah, I would just add to say that this is an issue that, I mean, you're hitting on such an important issue in terms of, but I think it's one that's very under-discussed, if you will. Again, we spend a lot of time on the project development part, you know, getting steel in the ground, you know, all the operational regulatory issues around the projects themselves. Ultimately, it doesn't translate without the transmission question. And I would say that at least for the offshore wind community, this is something that we have to have much more focus on in terms of the siting of the facilities, the interconnectedness. And it's I would say this is an area we probably could improve quite a bit. Because it is something that you see for natural gas, for example. It's well understood in the pipeline industry and how these things work together. I think within the offshore wind community, we probably need to get a better understanding of how this will interact with FERC, you know, the authorities that exist, and what are the pain points, if you will, to try to get ahead of them. We probably should be there already, but I think it's a lot of work to be done.
I mean, you're going to run out of interconnection points at some point.
Right.
That just with the ambitions of, you know, how many gigawatts we want to generate on the shelf, it's not possible without some sort of a regional or mesh solution.
Hi, my name is Fang Luo. I'm an electrical engineering professor from Stony Brook University. So I actually have, so I wear two hats. One is researcher, the other one is educator. So I guess I have 3 points that I would like to ask or comment, and the first and second are connected. We have been working on, like the whole society has been working on integrating of wind power into the power grid for a long time, and it's surprisingly to hear that actually the grid operators still have a lot of concerns and takes a long time to convince them it's safe to connect this. The question is that how can we help? And the second question is that given such a long time for NEPA hold, and by the way, I suffer from that too, since if we have little project, it can be held up to 2 years before we can do any experiment. So in that case, as an educator, we're signed up to educate our new workforce and all the engineers to develop wind farms. However, I can't tell them after 2-3 years, hey guys, wait for another 10 years, our wind farm is about to run. So that's not good for them. So how can we actually mitigate this problem here and convince them this is a bright future that we should go after? And the third point I want to bring, I really like the story Tori just brought up, the Nexans learned a good lesson from others' projects. So I would like to see more of those kind of demonstration projects going on. But I also understand there's some consequence or risk behind this. For example, currently, there are a couple U.S. Department of Energy calls on bipartisan infrastructure demonstrations, and I'm on one of the team actually teaming up with Orsted. And at last moment, for the concept paper, Orsted has concern on the uncertainties of some of the risks that we cannot handle. It's actually, we're trying to use one of your 31 wind farms to do grid regulation. And however, something that we don't really know. So actually, Orsted, with this concern, Orsted put off. But I understand the consequence here. But for such kind of opportunities or demonstrations, how can the government actually chime in and actually provide more incentive to encourage our wind farm operators, as well as the grid, to work together to address those problems in a more coherent way, so that we take reasonable risk and do not let them run into bankrupt. So, yeah, those are my questions. Thanks.
I see we have a minute left, but I'll just say that,
You get the last word.
yeah, I'll have less than that. sitting on the plane the other day back from Oslo, I had two people, two young folks, younger than me, that clearly worked in the offshore wind industry, and the enthusiasm that they were talking about. You see it at the conferences, you see it at the engagements. I don't think there's a question about the opportunity set that exists within the industry, and I think it's really motivating for people to work on these projects. So I don't think they're going to be concerned about, is it going to happen? I think they're going to be there.
Yeah, I mean, from my side, Stony Brook's been a huge partner for us up and down the coast on fisheries issues, on grid. I think to the extent academic papers help point the way, working with Jigger Shaw in the Loan Program Office under Secretary Granholm and finding real demonstration projects that people can put their hands and fingers on is even more important, and showing, not just lecturing on how things might work, but showing people how they can work is just critically important. So getting as many of those Earth shots or moonshot projects going up and down the coast and even in the heartland, around DC, around where new technology can bring in superconductors part of the way, multi-day storage going to be part of the way that we solve this problem, and recognizing that those things are just going to take time is critically important.
Yeah, I was going to also add that as you're building these demonstration projects and then making sure that someone sees it, right? That it's going and seeing it and bringing legislators and other decision makers to see it and talking about the success story. That seeing is really believing, and I've seen it time and time again where it's really changed someone's perspective that was maybe a little more hostile, that like, oh, this is really the future. And also I wish your students the best. I think what we're talking about up here is just an incredible opportunity for the new energy future, and they're part of it. And they're going to be leading it one day. It's exciting.
All said. It's an incredible future.
I mean, it's a great note to end on. I see we're out of time, but look, one of the things that gets me so excited about being in this industry is that nothing's static, and we're always innovating, and the turbines are getting bigger. The floating wind is next, and that's going to be huge. This is the reason. I mean, one of the many reasons to be excited about offshore wind is just how we're pushing the barriers of what's possible. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.